Welcome to KIR Review. I intended to make this much closer to when I watched it, but clearly I didn't. Also the whole grumpy about my video editing software situation. Anyway, let's take a look at Godzilla -1. I'll start off with my non-spoiler review. The basic synopsis is that this film takes place as Japan is reeling from its losses in World War II. The nation has been brought down to level 0, and Godzilla's appearance brings it to -1. I've seen this 4 times in theaters, twice in IMAX and twice on the normal screen. Of all viewings though, I think the final showing on a normal screen was my favorite. The auditorium was full and everyone was loving it. It was one of the final showings in Sweden, so it felt fantastic to be part of a last surge of support. My first viewing rendered me speechless as I processed the fact that this is the single greatest Godzilla film that I had seen. That this is objectively the best Godzilla film I have seen. Forget my undying love of Godzilla against Mechagodzilla, Shin Godzilla, and even Godzilla vs. Mothra from 1992. No other Godzilla film can hold a candle to -1 for one pure and simple fact. Toho figured out the formula for superb human drama in a giant monster movie. All that's not to say it's completely without flaws. Every movie has mistakes, but I absolutely recommend this film. Now you know what time it is. If you haven't seen the film yet, go watch it on Netflix. For the rest, let's get into the meat and potatoes. The film starts off in the closing days of the Pacific Theater of World War II. Kamikaze pilot Koichi Shikishima feigns engine trouble and lands his plane on Odo Island, where kamikaze-specific mechanics were stationed. That night, a creature the islanders call Godzilla comes ashore and attacks. Shikishima is overcome by fear and is unable to fire his plane's gun at the creature. The attack results in the deaths of every mechanic except one, Sosaku Tachibana, and Shikishima himself. On a ship back to the mainland, Tachibana thrusts photos of the deceased into Shikishima's hands. Upon arrival home, Shikishima discovers that his parents died in the firebombing and a neighbor, Sumiko, lost all 3 of her children in the blaze. The next day, Shikishima is at a market when he encounters a woman named Noriko and an orphaned baby named Akiko. Events pull them together as a makeshift family. After a search, Shikishima takes a job removing mines seeded around Japan. Despite his income, Noriko eventually takes an office job in Ginza. Not all is well though, as also during this time Godzilla is caught in the blast of an atom bomb test in the Pacific. He's horrifically wounded but mutated and begins attacking vessels around the area. American military forces are forbidden from taking action against Godzilla for fear of the Soviets getting the wrong idea about their presence. So Japan is left to fend for itself. As a glimmer of hope, the country is allowed to bring back the warship Takao for use against Godzilla. In more bad news, Shikishima and his crew are ordered to essentially act as bait for Godzilla and buy time for Takao to arrive in Japanese waters. Godzilla arrives at their location, and after a tense chase followed by a battle with Takao, Godzilla emerges victorious. Despite the threat, Japan's government decides to keep it out of public knowledge. Later on, Godzilla makes landfall in Ginza and Noriko is caught in the attack. Despite going in to help her, Shikishima ends up as the sole survivor of Godzilla's wrath. He and his crew end up going to a meeting of private citizens, which turns out to be all ex-military, working on a plan to stop Godzilla. As a failsafe, Shikishima offers to fly a plane and lure Godzilla if needed. They manage to enlist the help of Tachibana to restore a prototype Shinden plane. Unknown to everyone else, Shikishima and Tachibana load the plane with explosives. On the day of the attack, Godzilla arrives early and makes landfall. For the plan to work, he needs to be in the deepest part of Tokyo Bay. Shikishima is deployed and successfully lures him. Using 2 empty battleships as decoys, the makeshift army manages to force Godzilla to waste his devastating atomic breath. They wrap him in cables carrying Freon gas tanks and detonate them. Godzilla plunges under the water with incredible speed, but the rapid pressurization wasn't enough to kill him. Plan B is deployed and Godzilla is rapidly brought back up. Even with rapid decompression, Godzilla manages to detach himself from the inflatables, stopping his ascent. With a surprise arrival from a fleet of tugboats, the 2 remaining ships are able to pull Godzilla the rest of the way back up. Despite his horrible injuries, Godzilla prepares another atomic breath. Just before he can fire, Shikishima flies his plane into the monster's mouth and the explosives detonate. Godzilla's body disintegrates, unable to properly contain the radiation within. The Shinden, however, had an ejection seat and Shikishima engaged it at the last second. Back ashore, Shikishima learns that Noriko is in the hospital and races there with Akiko to see her. The family is reunited, but Noriko is unknowingly dealing with a permanent change from Godzilla's attack in Ginza. Overall, I think the plot is solid. It's more of a human drama featuring Godzilla, which I think a lot of other entries into the franchise tried to be. -1 does this right, focusing on Shikishima's struggles first, and using Godzilla not only as a physical threat to all Japan, but also as a specter that continuously haunts him. The relationship between Shikishima, Noriko, and Akiko evolves very smoothly, as do the other interpersonal relationships. The story hits hard on cultural norms of wartime Japan, particularly honor culture. It was considered better for kamikaze pilots to die in vain than to go home alive. Men deemed cowards were thought to have cost Japan the war despite America's overwhelming power and unrelenting advance. And that mindset dominated even after 2 cities were wiped off the map, or maybe 3 if we count the bombing of Tokyo. In the context of -1 and Godzilla's threat, this mindset diminishes in favor of cooperation and no longer viewing military personnel as nothing more than cannon fodder. The 2 most notable relationship shifts are between Shikishima and Sumiko, and Shikishima and Tachibana. Sumiko is initially sour towards Shikishima, but as his bond with Noriko and Akiko strengthens, Sumiko warms back up and takes over as Akiko's babysitter when needed. Tachibana holds Shikishima responsible for the deaths of his men on Odo Island, but in the end, when he discovers the Shinden's ejection seat, he makes Shikishima aware of it and tells him to live. One of the bigger criticisms, and one I agree with, is the ending of the Ginza attack. As the shockwave from Godzilla's atomic attack nears, Noriko pushes Shikishima half a meter into an alleyway, and that somehow keeps him safe, aside from being tossed around. Noriko takes the hit and is blown away. With such a short distance to safety, she could have easily shoved him while propelling herself, and they would have both survived. As far as Godzilla's story goes, he's portrayed as quite vengeful toward humanity. It really seems as though he knows his suffering is our fault. It's a nice touch that he still seems to target specific people despite being 50 meters tall. It's a behavior he kept from the Odo Island attack. The plan for defeating Godzilla being more scientifically grounded is a nice touch. Swapping out 1954's oxygen destroyer for encasing Godzilla in Freon gas bubbles, causing him to sink rapidly, is more exciting to watch, at least in my opinion. And then rapid decompression as the plan B added a good amount of tension to the scene, especially when Godzilla managed to detach the inflatables while sustaining severe damage. I can't say for sure if Yamazaki took a page out of Anno's book considering the tactic in Shin Godzilla, but the 2 live-action movies to come out of Japan so far in this new era seem to be wanting to blend more science fact into the fiction. Another big criticism, and one I don't agree with, is Noriko's fate being a last-minute change. Though Yamazaki himself confirmed that she died in the first draft of the film, we don't know how many drafts it went through. And his explanation is quite clear that the decision of whether she lived or died was up in the air throughout production. Ultimately, it was decided that she would survive. Doesn't sound like a last-minute change to me. It sounds like, okay, we're starting to wrap things up and put this film together. Do we want the happy ending or the tragic ending? Plus, for all we know, a tragic ending was filmed, but of course never made it in. Decisions like this are made all the time in film. And in music, which I know a thing or two about. We can argue about whether or not the happy ending is forced. Personally, I don't think it was forced, but given the information we have, it definitely wasn't a last-minute change. Last-minute decision, maybe, but one they'd been deliberating over the course of production. I like the open-ended nature of the final scene. It doesn't guarantee a sequel, but it doesn't really need one either. The film's purpose has been fulfilled. And like many Godzilla films before it, -1 essentially carries the message that once Pandora's box has been opened, we can't put the contents back in. Godzilla can never truly be destroyed, the atomic bomb can never be unmade. Oh, and the dog survives. Very important. You know which part I'm talking about. Now let's move on to character reviews. I touched on a few of them in the plot review, but here I'll go more in depth. Overall, I think every major character was very well written. Koichi Shikishima is of course our main character. He gets dealt a rough hand from the start. He feigns engine troubles to get out of killing himself for no reason at the tail end of the war, freezes up in sheer terror when Godzilla is just a few meters away from his plane, and then gets blamed for the deaths of nearly every mechanic on Odo Island. And that's just in the first 10 minutes of the film. Then he gets home to find his neighborhood firebombed, his parents are dead, and he's blamed again for the firebombing because he was too afraid of a silly little suicide run. It's no wonder he develops nightmares. Things start to turn around a little when Noriko and Akiko come into his life, but he still can't fully let Noriko in, not while the ghosts, and a very real monster, still haunt him. His first noticeable character growth is during Godzilla's second appearance, the tense boat chase. When the first mine fails to damage Godzilla, Shikishima leaps up to the machine gun. Though his hand trembles like it did on Odo Island, he pushes past his fear and fires the gun. After the second mine fails to detonate in Godzilla's mouth, Shikishima gains a burst of determination and uses the gun to blow up the mine. While it ultimately wasn't enough to kill Godzilla, this does give Shikishima the information he needs for the final battle. Afterward, he finally confides in Noriko all the events he's been silently suffering from. The next morning, he finally feels a glimmer of hope that maybe he isn't destined to suffer merely because he escaped death while others didn't. After losing Noriko in the Ginza attack, Shikishima becomes single-mindedly focused on destroying Godzilla. Despite the plan of killing Godzilla using rapid pressurization, followed by rapid depressurization, Shikishima wants a 100% guarantee that Godzilla will die in their next encounter. He manages to track down Sosaku Tachibana, the only remaining mechanic from Oto Island, and accepts a royal beating for exactly how he drew Tachibana back to him. Tachibana and his new crew agree to load the nose of the Shinden plane with powerful explosives. In the end, when the original plan proves to have failed in killing Godzilla, Shikishima feigns a suicide attack and ejects in the last second before the Shinden's nose enters Godzilla's mouth. The plane detonates, completely destroying Godzilla's head. Shikishima has finally redeemed himself. His war is finally over. Despite clues that Shikishima will survive, there's an equal amount of clues that he's completely unstable and has a death wish. In my first viewing, I really didn't know which way it would go until it happened. To me, that's some brilliant writing. I did have my hunch he was going to eject, but I still didn't want to fully commit. We're introduced to Noriko when Shikishima is at a local market. She'd stolen some food, quite literally ran into Shikishima, handed Akiko to him, whom he accepted in his bewilderment, and managed to escape. When they meet again, Noriko follows Shikishima to his house. He lets her and Akiko stay to eat, but then requests they leave. Noriko stubbornly decides to stay, even falling asleep, or at least doing a fine job pretending, and Shikishima relents. He ultimately decides that Noriko and Akiko can stay, at least for a while. Their relationship as an unorthodox family begins to develop. By the time Shikishima announces that he's taking a job removing mines in the sea, Noriko has grown attached enough that she forbids him to die. Noriko also frequently moves to comfort Shikishima after his nightmares. By the time the house is fixed and Shikishima has his 3 crewmates over for dinner, he and Noriko are all but officially husband and wife. Shikishima's denial of their relationship spurs Noriko to look for her own job. When Shikishima gets home on her first day of work, she explains that she took a job to get back on her own feet so that he could find a proper wife. This hits Shikishima out of left field, as despite his verbal denial, he does see them as a couple at the very least. After the incident with Godzilla and the Takao, Noriko manages to convince Shikishima to take down his shields and let her into his mind. When he breaks down again, Noriko desperately tries to get him to see his circumstances as proof he's meant to survive, just like she is. The next day, she's caught up in the Ginza attack, first on the train where her survival instinct kicked in, and again in a crowd running down a street with Godzilla right behind them. At this point, she seems to be in some sort of shock and her mindset shifts to a hopeless state. After someone knocks her down, she stares up at Godzilla, accepting her fate. At that point, Shikishima manages to get to her and uses her own survival speech back on her. The two manage to get distance between themselves and Godzilla just before the military attacks the monster. Once Godzilla unleashes his atomic breath and the shockwave gets close to them, Noriko decides to sacrifice herself to save Shikishima and is carried away by the force of the blast. At the end, it's revealed that she survived and is recovering in the hospital. I am more inclined to think that she either died briefly or was on the brink of death by the time one or more of Godzilla's shards got into her system and she gained the monster's regenerative properties. At what cost remains to be seen, if at all, since it depends on if Yamazaki is asked to do a sequel. And even then, he'd have to want to continue following Shikishima and Noriko. Shikishima's development is largely over, but -1's ending does set Noriko up for her own battle. Sosaku Tachibana is the lead mechanic on Oto Island. During Godzilla's initial attack, Tachibana persuades Shikishima to sneak over to his plane and fire his gun. The weapons the mechanics have on hand are basic rifles that likely won't do more than irritate the beast. When Shikishima freezes up despite having Godzilla's head close up and a shot lined up, one of the mechanics in hiding starts to panic and fires at Godzilla. The beast does indeed get even more agitated and attacks the trench where the mechanics were hiding. Tachibana receives not only a permanent leg injury, but also visceral memories of every single one of his men being brutally killed. The next morning, Tachibana blames their deaths on Shikishima's inaction, collects photos of the deceased, and forces Shikishima to keep them. We don't see Tachibana again until the 3rd act, but he's still very much holding a grudge against Shikishima. However, after hearing his kamikaze-like plan, Tachibana agrees to help get the Shinden plane flight ready. Despite this grudge, when Tachibana discovers the Shinden has an ejection seat, he urges Shikishima to use it once the explosives are armed. His change of heart likely happened after Shikishima pulled out Akiko's drawing of her family, and Shikishima explaining that he's now fighting for her future. Tachibana saw Shikishima's growth in that moment and knew he was looking at a more courageous man than the pilot from Oto Island. Sumiko Ota is Shikishima's closest neighbor, by proximity only, as we very quickly learn. She blames him, and cowards like him, for the bombing of their village and the deaths of her 3 children. After initial skepticism toward Shikishima's intent for taking in Noriko and the infant Akiko, Sumiko begins to warm back up, if only to ensure Akiko's survival. She gladly babysits Akiko after Noriko takes an office job, and tries to console the child after Noriko is lost in the Ginza attack. On the day of the counterattack, Shikishima entrusts Akiko and all his assets to Sumiko, should the worst come to pass. It's Sumiko who accepts the telegram from a hospital notifying the household that Noriko is there recovering. Sumiko takes Akiko to the port that the battleships are returning to, and wordlessly chastises Shikishima for his recklessness, before handing both the telegram and Akiko to him. Seiji Akitsu is a veteran and the captain of the minesweeping vessel Shikishima is assigned to. He's very critical of Japan's government, particularly the culture of silence surrounding Godzilla. He has somewhat of a mentoring relationship with the youngest crew member, Shiro Mizushima, and serves as a sort of counter to Shikishima. Particularly towards the end, he grows suspicious of Shikishima's intentions with a plane in the counterattack against Godzilla. Akitsu also demonstrates a protective role with Mizushima, blocking him from joining the veterans in their plan to stop Godzilla. He's seen enough death and wants to hand off a better, calmer world to the next generation. Kenji Noda, nicknamed Doc, is another veteran in Shikishima's crew. He was a naval engineer during the war. After the Ginza attack, Noda is revealed to be the mastermind of the private citizen counterattack plan. Like Akitsu, Noda is concerned about Shikishima's mental state, especially after losing Noriko. He stresses the possibility of dying in the attack on Godzilla, but almost everyone in the meeting Shikishima attended have faith in both Noda and the plan. Shiro Mizushima is the youngest member in Shikishima's crew, so young in fact that he was ineligible to fight in the war. His spunk for fighting immediately irritates Shikishima and is also the reason that Akitsu keeps an eye on him. Akitsu continually reminds Mizushima that war is nothing to be excited about. By the third act, when Akitsu bars him from joining the attack on Godzilla, Mizushima expresses that despite not being a veteran, he wants to help defend Japan. However, this gives him the opportunity to be resourceful, and just as the battleships are struggling to pull Godzilla the rest of the way to the surface, Mizushima is revealed to have enlisted every tugboat in the area to come and help. Akiko is an infant whose parents died in the firebombing. Her mother begged Noriko to save the child. Though she doesn't play a big role, Akiko's reactions to Noriko being gone and Shikishima's behavior on the eve of the counterattack are quite intuitive. "Mommy needs to be away for a while," said in a solemn, mournful tone, is a mismatch and easily detected by a child. Anyone complaining about Akiko crying at completely acceptable points in the story is tone deaf. She also serves as Shikishima's secondary motivator to survive, as even though he's lost Noriko, Akiko is still depending on him and he doesn't want to orphan her twice. Yamazaki's Godzilla design has gone through many changes leading up to -1. We first got a look at it in 2007's Always Sunset on 3rd Street 2 as a cameo in a dream sequence. Back then, it was very clearly based on the Godzilla we saw in 2001's Giant Monsters All-Out Attack, even featuring eyes devoid of pupils and irises. He would have over a decade to tweak the design, and we saw the version 2 in 2021 when Godzilla the Ride opened. This version had normal eyes and the dorsal spines had changed fairly drastically. It no longer obviously resembled the Godzilla from 2001. In the short amount of time that passed between the ride and -1, there were only a few tweaks to the design, particularly lengthening the dorsal plates. The yellow iris color really gives Godzilla a sinister look. Even in his original smaller form, Godzilla's eyes portrayed pure malice. And you can't convince me that the bulging near-white eyes during the final battle was not an Easter egg. Going back to Odo Island, Godzilla is portrayed with a pronounced hunch forward, reminiscent of dinosaur depictions. He still has dorsal plates, and even then, they're noticeably large in proportion to the rest of his body. The structure of the head and neck changed most drastically after Godzilla is hit by the bomb's radiation. On Odo Island, the face is longer and the neck has a more standard reptilian connection to the rest of the body. After the alteration, Godzilla receives his classic upright posture. His head gets more rounded and the snout is a little shorter. I really like the mechanics of how this Godzilla charges his breath. The dorsal plates glow and push outward as the energy slowly moves up from the tail tip to his mouth. Once fully charged, the plates push back in and the stream of blue radiation is unleashed. The reveal of how his breath worked in Ginza was very well done. I'm not sure where -1 Godzilla would rank in my list of Godzilla designs yet, but it definitely grew on me fast. The soundtrack for -1 is incredible. Naoki Sato really hit it out of the park. My favorite piece is Divine. We first hear it when Takao shows up, and later in Ginza when Godzilla prepares his breath attack. It creates a very tense and chilling atmosphere that fits this Godzilla perfectly. My only real critique about the soundtrack is the Godzilla suite that played during the first part of the Ginza attack. While the updated recordings are fun to hear, I felt it was a bit too marchy for the attack sequence. I think an updated version of Godzilla's Rampage from 1954 would have fit better. But as I said, the soundtrack is otherwise a perfect fit for the movie, and the updated Godzilla recordings are all that I wish we got in Shin Godzilla, instead of mishmashing the older recordings with Evangelion scores. As far as Godzilla's roar is concerned, it was done simply by recording the original 1954 roar through a speaker. To this day, I'm not sure how I feel about that, but it's not like it doesn't work. As for visual effects, well, this film did win an Oscar for them. And that's saying something when comparing the budget to its Hollywood competitors. I think the visuals were solid, particularly the atomic breath effects. Probably one of my favorite charge-ups. But it's still not without its flaws. There was wonky and clunky CGI here and there. One thing I wish they would have done is made a suit for the walking scenes. Something about CGI Godzilla just walking felt less real than a guy in a suit. Felt clunkier somehow. Or maybe just Godzilla legs for the motion capture guy. Like that 1954 behind-the-scenes photo of Haruo Nakajima just wearing the legs. As a quick bonus, I watched the minus color version, also available on Netflix, so I'll post my thoughts on the differences. Overall, I still think the acting and music had a greater impact than whether or not the film was in color or monochrome. Ironically enough, Godzilla's scenes didn't have the effect I thought they would have. I found myself more immersed in a 1950s-style setting when it came to smaller details. The deployment of the Freon gas cylinders and the bending of the cranes looked more like period practical effects than the more lackluster and clunky CGI we see in the normal version. Larger vehicles, even entire battleships, looked like miniatures that we would have seen on set in any Showa-era Godzilla film. So that surprised me. I definitely recommend watching both, since minus color still offers a different experience of the film. Godzilla Minus One is objectively the most well-made entry to the franchise. The human story is the strongest it's ever been, which is needed when Godzilla's classic screen time ranges from 9 to 20 minutes in most cases. Survivor's guilt may be the dominant theme, but it was blended well with lesser themes of individuals coming together as families, communities working to rebuild from the ashes, and a cultural shift away from viewing soldiers as disposable to valuing all lives. Godzilla by no means takes a back seat, but rather enhances all these themes and bolsters the main character arcs. It's a masterpiece in its own franchise and a masterpiece in film. Thanks for watching. If you liked this video, show your support by hitting the like button and then check out my other videos. If you like those, subscribe for future content.